If you remember, from the beginning of the series we learned that the definition of archaeology is the study of human history through artifacts. Tonight we will begin looking at one of the most remarkable artifacts that has ever been found, and it is directly related to the most pivotal moment in history, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Mark records that Joseph of Arimathea bought fine linen and wrapped the body of Jesus in the linen when his body was placed in the tomb. This next movie will introduce us to an artifact that remarkably matches up with those scriptures. When I first began to look into this next item, I, like many others, was very skeptical, and I was sure that it had been totally disproven. However, many scientists now agree that the singular carbon dating test that seemed to disprove the authenticity of this next mysterious item is now considered unreliable, and new evidence has surfaced that validates this artifact as authentic.
On the 8th of October 1978, in the Italian city of Turin, an unprecedented event took place. For the first time, the church allowed scientists to examine the Shroud of Turin, one of the most mysterious objects in the Western world. For 120 hours, the Shroud of Turin research project ran thousands of tests on this 14-foot piece of linen, believed by many to be the sacred burial shroud of Jesus Christ.
We opened up Pandora's box and created a whole new group of questions.
One of the leading members of the team was Ray Rogers, a highly respected chemist from the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Rogers was a man of science, not God, but he was intrigued by the shroud. It harbored great mysteries that he wanted to solve.
I don't believe in miracles that defy the laws of nature.
If the shroud was real, this fragile piece of cloth has survived 2,000 years. According to the Gospels, Jesus was crucified by the Romans. His body was taken down from the cross and wrapped in a shroud. Many believe that after Christ's resurrection, the shroud was saved. But the story of this cloth is as mysterious as the life of the person it portrays. For centuries, the shroud vanished. In the 14th century, a shroud appeared in the French town of Liry. People claimed it was Christ's. It was a time of famine and plague in Europe. Fear and superstition gave rise to a huge market in religious relics, many of them forgeries. Fragments of Christ's crown of thorns and slivers of wood from his cross were a focus for hopes and prayers.
This is a time when people couldn't look to the government, they couldn't look to a vaccine, they couldn't look to the army, they couldn't look to anything to protect them except Jesus, except the saints, except these relics, bits of the true cross that, if you put them together, would probably make a redwood tree.
There were many different shrouds, all claimed to be Christ's. But the most seductive was the shroud at Liry. It was amazingly detailed, with a faint image of a man, and it captured the imagination of all who saw it.
There's an emotional attachment to the Shroud of Turin that very few other objects have, but the shroud is so powerful in the image that it bears and the significance of that image to so many people.
But the shroud had its share of misfortune. Fire nearly destroyed it in 1532. and water stained the image. Nuns repaired the shroud and attached a protective backing cloth. In 1578, the shroud moved to its current resting place in northern Italy. For the next 4 centuries, it was kept in Turin and occasionally displayed to the faithful. But few outside Italy knew of the shroud or had seen the faint image of Christ. It was only in 1898 that the world finally became aware of the incredible image on the shroud. Italian Seconda Pia took the first photograph. When it was published, the shroud became world famous.
When Secondo Pia makes this photograph, he almost dropped the plate. It scared him because he said, "My God, I was looking into the face of the Lord." That's when he realized that the image on the cloth is a negative. The lights and darks are reversed from what we're used to seeing.
For the first time, people could clearly see the body on the shroud as a positive image. The photograph displayed details that were invisible to the naked eye. It triggered an uproar.
He's immediately accused of fraud, immediately accused of cheating, lying, and manipulating this. It's a fake. And it wasn't until 1931 when Giuseppe Henriet is allowed to photograph the shroud for the second time, gets the same results, of course. The world of science suddenly looks at the shroud and says, well, wait a minute, maybe we should look at this closer.
Scientists couldn't get access to the sacred relic, but the photographs were now in the public domain. And as the 20th century progressed, new technology was set to reveal even more detailed images of the face in astonishing 3D. By the 1970s, the Turin Shroud was world famous. Many believed it was the burial shroud of Jesus, and yet scientists hadn't been able to examine it. But advances in photographic analysis were starting to uncover incredible clues hidden in the image itself. One breakthrough was made using a remarkable new imaging device. The VP8 was originally designed to analyze aerial photographs. It converts the light and dark on a traditional two-dimensional image to create a brightness map displayed on a 3D grid. Scientists wondered if it could be used to shed new light on the shroud. Engineer Peter Schumacher helped develop the VP8.
Nobody in our company had ever even heard of the Shroud of Turin, let alone seen pictures or wanted to look at image analysis of the Shroud of Turin.
When Schumacher placed an ordinary photograph under the machine, it displayed levels of brightness, but revealed no 3D data.
If we look, cheeks really aren't that flat. His eyebrows are not really grooved into his forehead. His nose really doesn't smear all over his face.
This is how every photo appeared. The machine couldn't decipher real height and depth to display a true 3D image. But when an image of the shroud was placed under the device, something remarkable happened.
All of a sudden, we're seeing contrast that has something to do with height and depth, real distance. The nose has a prominence, the cheeks roll off, the hair has a shape to it and is rounded. The whole image has dimension to it.
The results suggested that the shroud image could have been created by a real human body.
The shroud is a very unique image, the only one of its kind in the whole world. Nothing else like it. Three-dimensional relief, the front, and the back of a whole human being. Only one in the world. No other, nowhere, no how, no way. I don't know any way to make it. I've never heard of a way to make it. Just the Shroud of Turin.
Armed with these results and keen to find out more, a group of scientists formed the Shroud of Turin Research Project. They lobbied church authorities for permission to analyze the shroud.
They said, we should see if we can figure out how this image was formed. The biggest problem has always been access to the cloth itself.
Finally, in the spring of 1978, despite strong resistance from many in the Vatican, the church agreed.
The church took a relatively enlightened view about the shroud. They have a lot of folks who believe, in fact, that it is and truly the burial shroud of Christ and don't want anybody meddling with it. The other side of the coin is that if we don't let the scientists look at it, we'll never know what the truth is.
For the first time, science had a chance to test the authenticity of one of Christianity's holiest relics.
It was a very solemn and moving moment. I have to confess that I was taken with it for a few minutes until I got my wits about me and realized that we had to get down to business.
The scientists were not allowed to mark, cut, or damage the shroud in any way.
All these tests had to be non-destructive. Most of the local folks really didn't like us messing around with this holy object. We were guarded around the clock by a detail of carabinieri, the Italian state police, replete with machine guns, who watched not only us, but everyone that came and went. We all had special identification. Apparently there had been some threats during that time period, and they weren't taking any chances.
The team's main goal was to discover how the image got on the shroud. Was it made with paint or another way? They had only 5 days to conduct their tests and worked round the clock. Barry Schwartz was a photographer on the team.
There were spectral analyses done. Sam Pellicore had a spectrophotometer with him that he was using. There were a mosaic of photographs made. It was photographed with ultraviolet fluorescence photography. It was X-rayed using X-ray fluorescence and reflectance imaging.
One of the leading scientists involved was Ray Rogers, an acclaimed chemist who led thermochemical research at Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was developed. The cloth was composed of linen thread, finely woven in a herringbone pattern. Rogers was particularly interested in the areas damaged by the fire in 1532.
My primary field is thermochemistry. I look at the effects of heat on materials. And here were these scorches on this cloth. I was asked, can I determine whether or not it was painted? There wasn't any painting material there of any kind. And even more important than that to me was that they dumped water on it to put out the fire. Nothing in the image moved with the water. You know, it's rather staggering because at one fell swoop that pretty much eliminates almost everything that could have been used to paint the image.
One of the major components of linen is cellulose. And what we see on the surface of that darkness that gives rise to the image is in fact degraded cellulose. It's not a pigment.
Next, the scientists looked at areas where the image displayed bleeding wounds and made a stunning discovery. The chemical signature of real blood. The team had discovered a powerful connection to the crucifixion. According to biblical accounts, Jesus was nailed to the cross. As he bled, red blood cell walls would have ruptured, releasing hemoglobin, the blood component which transfers oxygen around the body. When hemoglobin breaks down, it creates bilirubin, the substance that causes bruises to turn yellow. Analysis showed that the stains contained very high levels of bilirubin, consistent with the trauma of crucifixion. And UV photography revealed one more incredible clue.
You can visually see these serum stains around the blood stains that were never visible until our team photographed the shroud with UV fluorescence photography approximately 2,000 years after this man ostensibly was killed.
Serum is the liquid medium in which red blood cells are suspended. It remained invisible until UV light made the dried serum fluoresce.
No medieval artist could have anticipated the invention of ultraviolet fluorescence photography and said, well, I'm going to hide this serum stain, and 700 years from now, they'll find it. Give me a break.
Ray Rogers and the team finished their research in 1978 with more questions than answers. The image might have been created by contact with a real body, but whose body was it? When had he died? And was he really crucified? Crucifixion was a gruesome, drawn-out and painful death, reserved for criminals and the lowest rung of Roman society.
You weren't nailed up there to kill you. You were nailed up to be crucified, tortured. They didn't want you to die right away. In fact, there were evidence that they were surprised that Jesus died so soon.
It's difficult to get scientific data on crucifixion because the last official Roman crucifixion happened in the year 337. But in a quiet suburb of New York City, one man's been experimenting with crucifixion for years. Forensic pathologist Dr. Frederick Zuckerby has investigated many gruesome crime scenes as chief medical examiner for Rockland County, New York.
My area was mechanism, manner, and cause of death and type of suffering the individual had.
Since 1948, Dr. Zuckerby has been investigating the shroud to answer a fundamental question. Does the evidence on the shroud match up with a person who died by crucifixion? First, the doctor built a cross to determine how crucifixion killed people. The assumption was that the victim suffocated under the weight of his own body. But the doctor's experiments suggested otherwise.
The cause of death was due to shock, which causes failure of the heart as a pump.
Next, he looked at how the nails were driven through the hand. The shroud shows a pool of blood near the wrists. But are human hands nailed to a cross strong enough to support a crucified body? The doctor designed special gloves to find out. His tests revealed that the nails would support the body. But he also made another startling find. The Roman practice of nailing the victim's palms to the cross would have ruptured the median nerve, turning the thumbs inwards. A careful examination of the shroud revealed exactly this. The thumbs were hidden underneath the palms, just as one would expect in a crucifixion. There are a number of other clues that the doctor's investigation found on the shroud.
Looking at the face, it was not symmetrical, showing evidence of a beating. I looked at the angulations of the blood in the head region where the crown of thorns was. The blood flows going along where the muscles will contract, and they had a corkscrew appearance. The blood shows a flow in the back of the hand, and it runs nicely along the side, and it accumulates a pool. I've seen it in many, many cases of injuries to the hand in the medical examiner's office.
From his research, the doctor came to one overwhelming conclusion about the image on the shroud.
From the forensic pathology point of view, It is totally consistent with a crucified individual. I have no doubts at all.
Dr. Zagaby's tests and the photographic evidence matched up. The victim on the shroud had been crucified. But was it Jesus Christ or a medieval man? To answer this crucial question, scientists had to find out how old the shroud was. And that required the cooperation of the Catholic Church. In 1988, scientists lobbied for permission to take a sample of cloth for carbon dating. Unknown to them, Pope John Paul II was already consulting his own scientific advisors and had reached a decision.
I was in Rome at the time, and there was this real tension, this real controversy as to whether this should be subjected to these scientific tests. I mean, if this is the burial shroud of Jesus, is that not an indignity to what is the only physical link to the Savior? And others would say, well, look, if this is a fraud, we need to know one way or another. And John Paul II, to his credit, and the Vatican, to its credit, said, no, we're going to put this to the knife, literally.
It was a historic decision. Scientists were finally given permission to carbon date the shroud. For this test, the sample would have to be burnt. Permanently destroying a piece of the shroud was a highly controversial action. The church authorities imposed strict conditions on the scientists, only allowing a small sample to be cut from a damaged corner of the shroud.
It was a convenient choice. It was in an area of a cloth that nobody was going to complain about. Nobody was going to take issue with the fact that they're pulling threads from the more pristine parts of the cloth.
The section removed from the damaged corner was divided into 4. One piece was sent to Oxford University, another to the Swiss Institute of Technology in Zurich, and 2 smaller pieces were sent to the University of Arizona. Dr. Tim Jowell was a member of the Arizona team.
Everybody and all the plants and all the animals on the surface of this planet have approximately the same amount of carbon-14 in them as long as they're alive. When we die, the C14 in our bodies decays with a known decay rate. If we measure the carbon-14 in the sample and compare it to a standard, we can calculate the age from the ratio of the sample to the standard.
First, the shroud sample was cleaned of any impurities. Then it was burnt.
We start off with a piece of linen and we combust it at this end, turning the carbon of that sample into a gaseous state.
The CO2 gas was then solidified and the carbon was extracted. Each carbon sample was then shot through an accelerating mass spectrometer, which counted each individual carbon-14 atom.
This particle detector can count 1 atom at a time. For a modern sample, we count upwards of 100 atoms per second. For an old sample, one that's close to 50,000 years, we may count 5 or 10 atoms in 2 minutes.
By counting the number of atoms, scientists calculated the date. For the test, each lab worked in isolation. Finally, after checking and rechecking their results, they had the answer. They knew how old the shroud was.
We wanted to make sure we were right, so we measured it more times than we would regularly, and we knew that it wouldn't be 2,000 years old after 5 minutes. The Shroud of Turin turned out to be a medieval sample from the 14th century, and that's what the radiocarbon date shows.
The shroud was dated between 1260 and 1390. The result was a stunning revelation, making headlines around the world. It was now a scientific fact. The Shroud of Turin could not be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. Despite the evidence, many of the faithful refused to accept the carbon dating results. Their belief in the shroud was unshakable. And soon they made a discovery that cast doubt on all the scientific work. By 1988, the Turin Shroud was the most controversial relic in the Christian world. Carbon dating had concluded that it was a 14th century fake and not the burial shroud of Jesus. But scientific tests also concluded that the image wasn't painted, and the cloth contained the chemical components of real blood. As a result, the faithful still believed that the shroud could be genuine, and the carbon dating flawed.
Here you have the most studied artifact in human history, and science still can't give us an answer.
Ray Rogers, a member of the team that conducted the first scientific investigation, had always kept an open mind about the shroud. But as a man of science, he was furious that the shroud believers started questioning the carbon dating evidence.
I'd been reading these things by people from the lunatic fringe who were explaining why the date was wrong. I was irritated and just getting mad. I don't have any faith at all in somebody who says, I think I see flowers on the shroud, or I think I see little sailing ships sailing along.
There are people who are so emotionally involved in this that they're not going to accept any scientific result. Their faith is not going to be shaken by some pointy-headed scientist.
In the remote mountains of Panama, one shroud believer's obsession was about to spark renewed interest in the shroud. Peter Sooms is a retired doctor and a 3D imaging expert who now works as an artist.
The Shroud of Turin is one huge message, a gift of God to the world.
While researching a sculpture, Dr. Sooms came across an image of the shroud, and it changed his life.
I have the feeling that that image touches the soul of people.
Using his medical skills, he started a remarkable project that would bring the still image to life.
I got an obsessive thought in my head, because I didn't know about radiocarbon dating, I didn't know nothing. The only thing that was clear in my head was, this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ.
With the help of experts in Holland and Argentina, Dr. Sooms embarked on a complex process that would transform the face on the shroud into a 3D holograph.
I got the idea that there was holographic information in the Shroud of Turin. The image was divided into lots of slices. Then we put these pieces all together until it formed a 3D. So what we have in the computer now is the face of Jesus Christ in 3 dimensions.
After 3 years of painstaking work and computer processing, the 3D image of the body was complete. According to Dr. Sooms, this is the actual face of the historical Jesus, captured just moments after death, when he was wrapped in the shroud.
When I saw the results the first time, it really touched me emotionally very much. People start crying spontaneously when they stand in front of these images. And I've seen people change their life completely. It changed my life.
Publication of the image ignited fresh interest in the shroud, but it didn't prove the linen cloth was genuine. Shroud believers had to embrace scientific methods if they were to have any hope of challenging the carbon dating result. And in the United States in 2000, 2 people did just that. Sue Benford and her husband Joe Marino believed the shroud was real.
I'd never heard of the shroud before 1997. And I was flipping channels and saw the face on the TV. And there was something very knowing that I had, that was really Jesus' face.
This vision inspired Benford and her husband to find proof that the carbon dating results were wrong. neither of them were professional scientists. Benford ran a small non-profit organisation advocating the humane use of animals in scientific research, and Marino worked for Ohio State University. But they thought they'd found a vital clue, which proved the carbon dating was flawed.
Look here. Nowhere else is there this definitive, intentional dark green.
While checking images taken in 1978, Benford noticed something strange about the piece of shroud chosen for the carbon dating samples. The herringbone pattern that is so consistent elsewhere in the cloth looked misaligned.
Our theory is that there's a mixture of 16th century cloth and 1st century cloth, and the data that we're finding on the cloth matches that theory.
Benford and Marino believe that the carbon date was wrong because the section chosen for the samples was contaminated with later material. They believe the original linen was repaired with completely different cotton thread in the 16th century. The repair was then expertly dyed so that it would be invisible to the naked eye.
When you do this type of reweaving, you're not just stitching two pieces of material together, and that would give you all of one and all of the other. It's more like this. The ends are unraveled in the main cloth, the ends are unraveled in the patch, they are spliced together, and the threads are connected and interwoven, so you see literally an interweaving such that you have old and new on both sides of the equation.
Well, I'm skeptical when I'm listening to this, but they had taken photographs that were available of the samples taken for the carbon dating, and they had submitted these to several textile experts who didn't know they were looking at a photograph from the shroud, and each of these textile experts, independent of each other, said, you know, this looks rewoven. The samples taken for radiocarbon dating were cut from one corner of the shroud, adjacent to a seam. It was effectively an area that was damaged by someone cutting a piece out of it, possibly to sell as relic, so it needed to be repaired.
Benford and Marino argued that because the carbon dating sample contained material from both the 16th and 1st centuries, the result was in between the two. Searching for definitive proof, Benford took a closer look at the carbon dating results to see if there was anything odd about the data at the 3 different test centres. And hidden in the numbers, she found evidence that some parts of the test sample contained more 16th century cotton.
If you look at their unpublished data now, Arizona had some of the oldest dates at 1238 and the youngest at 1430. And you think, were they really 200 years off in their lab? Well, perhaps it's because of material they took from both of their different sides. Now, we don't know that for sure, and they haven't confirmed that. But that's interesting. Oxford is the next oldest, and they're the closest to this side with the most main 1st century material. Zurich is in the middle, and guess what? They have the middle amount, and they have the middle dates.
In 2000, Benford and Marino published a paper claiming that medieval cotton was introduced into the damaged corner of the linen shroud. Their claims were immediately dismissed by the scientific community. One scientist in particular was outraged.
One of the things Ray had a problem with was the fact these weren't scientists, and he didn't take them very seriously.
I think he lumped us in with the lunatic fringe at that time, and probably for many times beyond that.
I had given up on the shroud, and this was about the same time that the lunatic fringe were coming up with an infinite number of ways the date could be wrong, and this was just the last straw.
I got a call from Ray, and he goes, what the hell is this? This is nonsense. I can prove these people wrong in 5 minutes. And I said, well, Ray, go for it. He was the gunfighter. He was one of those guys that if he didn't like what you were saying, he'd have pulled out his 6-shooter and fired off 6 before he had a chance to take a breath. He was not very tolerant, especially of people doing bad science.
Rogers was in a unique position to confirm if the linen shroud contained later cotton repairs.
Ray had in his possession, from 1978, the tape samples lifted from the surface of the shroud. But remember, those were not big fibers, those were fibrils taken from the surface. He also had some samples that were taken from the shroud by Professor Reyes, who took samples in 1973 from a corner that was immediately adjacent to the area taken for carbon dating.
But Ray Rogers was in a race against time. He was fighting a losing battle with cancer, and he knew his end was near. His old friend Barry Schwartz was determined that Rogers should have the chance to speak from beyond the grave.
I am Ray Rogers, Raymond N. Rogers, and I've been working on the shroud since 1977.
He filmed a detailed interview with Rogers so that the dying scientist could put on the record exactly what he found.
So I read their paper and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples and I got out the shroud samples, and I went to work again.
A couple hours later, he calls me and he goes, boy, he says, I can't believe it. He says, they were right. There's cotton here. He says, there's no cotton in the rest of the shroud, but there's cotton interwoven here. They must be right.
No one was more shocked than Rogers. His observations seemed to confirm Benford and Marino's theory. The original linen shroud contained additional cotton threads. To confirm this, he needed to examine the threads that were carbon dated.
Until I could get a sample from the real radiocarbon cloth, a documented sample, I couldn't prove anything.
The carbon dating process destroyed the sample, but all the labs involved in the 1988 test kept parts of their sample in reserve.
The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino were right. And he found other evidence they had missed. He knew from his own tests in 1978 that the shroud was free of artificial dyes and pigments. And yet, when he looked at surviving threads from the carbon dating samples, that's exactly what he found.
You've got photomicrographs that demonstrate this very clearly. The cotton fibers from the radiocarbon sample are fairly heavily coated with the gum dye mordant, and some of the linen fibers don't show any of that at all. They look just as slick as anything, and it didn't stick to them.
He believed the dye was used to make the cotton repair invisible to the naked eye.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. The only thing in the shroud that was dyed or stained was this radiocarbon area. So my hypothesis at the moment is that this was done on purpose to fool your eye.
This was further evidence that the shroud was repaired with cotton in exactly the area where the carbon dating sample was taken.
And when we went back and looked at the ultraviolet photographs, here is this area that's significantly darker. It doesn't fluoresce as much, and it's just this area that, around the Ross sample and where the radiocarbon sample was cut. And if they had looked at any of the photographs that we had and studied the information we had as of 1978, They would have known that that was the worst possible place they could have taken a sample. My conclusion is that that area was manipulated. It was done by somebody with great skill and different materials than were used to make the shroud.
Here's the whole crux of it. Linen is very difficult to dye, and it ages as time goes on, so it's colored. So in order to match a reweaving with the original color, you have to use cotton, and you dye the cotton.
In 2005, just 5 weeks before losing his battle with cancer, Rogers prepared to publish his last academic paper. He wasn't casting doubt on the science of carbon dating, but the selection of a contaminated sample from the damaged corner of the shroud. In his opinion, the carbon dating tests didn't reveal its true age. But one fateful decision was about to threaten Ray Rogers' last hope of carrying out a new carbon dating test. By 2005, the scientific mainstream thought they'd laid the mystery of the Turin Shroud to rest. It was a fake, dated between 1260 and 1390. But scientist Ray Rogers had found new evidence suggesting the carbon dating sample was contaminated.
I'm coming to the conclusion that it has a very good chance of being the piece of cloth that was used to bury the historic Jesus.
He writes a paper that's accepted for publication in Thermochemica Acta, January of 2005. And that paper is the only peer-reviewed science that challenges the carbon date with anything credible up until that point in time.
Rogers knew that his findings needed to be tested with more sophisticated equipment. So he contacted a colleague who still worked at Los Alamos Laboratory, Bob Villarreal.
It was a race for him because he knew he was dying. He wanted to know, is this corner of the shroud of the same composition, whether it was flax or linen or cotton? If it was cotton, it's not the same as the main shroud cloth, which is linen.
Rogers would never live to discover the answer. He lost his long battle with cancer on the 8th of March, 2005. He was 78 years old. After Ray's death, Bob Villarreal was determined to honor his promise. He passed the fibers to a specialist, and something remarkable happened.
I received a call from him and he said, the thread that I was going to analyze broke into 2 pieces. Is God going to be mad at me?
Just as Rogers suspected, the threads appeared to be 2 pieces of cotton and linen woven together. In 2008, the findings were announced to the world. They supported the theory that the carbon dating sample was poorly chosen, as Rogers suggested in his final interview.
They come in and they snip, 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 snip in secret and take the worst possible sample they could. The people who certified the sample are still trying to convince everybody that everybody else is wrong. They're right. Those were perfectly valid samples.
Before he died, Rogers was a strong advocate for a new carbon dating test.
We have begun a journey into understanding the Shroud, and we will pick up here next week when we meet again.